Today we're going to do a video about stamped AK versus a milled AK. In particular, this Arsenal SGL-21 61 and also this Arsenal SLR-101S. Mikhail Kalashnikov originally designed the AK pattern rifle as a stamped receiver platform. They designed it out of thin sheet metal to be pressed, riveted, and welded together manually. That's the way that the rifle was designed. But because of the technology in Russia at the time, with welding on the rails that the bolt carrier group sits on, they wound up having to throw too many of them out, and because the rifles just didn't work. So what they had to do was move to a milled receiver. They would take a 6-pound block of metal and machine it down to a 2-pound AK receiver. It was if they would have had the technology, the stamp receiver at the time would have been great, but they didn't have the technology, so they moved to a much less cost-effective and much slower to produce milled receiver, and also much heavier. The original stamped AK was adopted by the Russian military in 1949 and was produced until 1951-52, when they realized that despite the weight savings of the stamped receiver, because of the technology at the time, they were throwing away too many AK rifles. They moved on to the milled receiver in about 1952. And from about 1952 to about 1959, the vast majority of AKs that were made out of milled receivers. After about 1959, they moved back to the stamped receiver and the AKM rifle, which was a return to the stamp system, but was much updated from the original stamped AK. Is your AK stamped or milled? Today, I'm going to talk about some of the differences between the two and some of the things that you can look for to distinguish whether or not your Kalashnikov rifle is a stamped or a milled variation. Alright, up top we have a stamped a stamped Arsenal SGL-21 61. Below, we have an Arsenal SLR-101S, which is a milled receiver AK. Now, from a distance, you might not be able to tell the difference between these two rifles, but if you've been around them a while and you know what to look for, the differences are pretty plain to see. Alright, now on a stamped AK, usually you will see this dimple above the magwell and these 5 rivets. Now, the rivets are where the front barrel trunnion and the rear stock trunnion are riveted in, and this dimple here is supposed to enhance the stability of the magazine. Now, some stamped AKs do not have them, but most of them do, especially the quality ones like an Arsenal. Now, that's something that's going to jump out at you right away. You move down here to your milled AK, and instead of seeing this dimple and the rivets, you don't see any rivets, and you see this rectangular cutout. No rivets back here as well. Alright, some of the other external differences that you can see, I don't know if you can tell this from the camera, but the angle and the shape of the stock on the stamped is slightly different than the angle of the milled. I think that the milled has a more pronounced hump on it. As well, externally, you can see, actually, let's start with the stamped one. Externally, you can see on a stamped AK that the sight graduations, so they go up to 10 here, they are out to 1,000 meters. On a milled AK, the sight post is different. You see the top number is 8. That's for 800 meters. Alright. Also, you will see, well, you can feel that there is a thicker barrel on a milled AK. This barrel is thinner. It's pretty obvious. When you feel the difference between the two, it's pretty obvious. Also, stamped AK versus a milled AK, the front sight posts are different. You can very clearly see when you look at this one that it is a completely different height, and it is a completely different width than the one on the milled. Now, the flash suppressors, the muzzle brakes on these are pretty much irrelevant, because this one right here, this Arsenal SGL-21, is actually a variation of the AK-103. Is the closest variation. How you can determine that is the synthetic furniture with the stainless steel heat shields and the handguards, and it also having the AK-74 style muzzle brake. Now, this milled AK down here is quite a different animal. There's really nothing else like it that I've ever seen. First of all, the milled AKs of the 50s did not really look like this. They had wood furniture. They were more ruggedly made. Well, not ruggedly, more crudely made, I should say. And they didn't have... They had the threads up here for a flash suppressor, but they didn't have a flash suppressor. Also, I'm going to use this Type 56 over here as a reference. Another one of the differences that you can tell externally between the milled and the stamped, usually, not in the case of this one, but usually in a stamped versus a milled, you will see that the gas ports for the gas tube and the gas block and the piston and everything, you will see that they are actually in the gas block on a stamped receiver. They're not in the tube. They run vertical in the gas block, where the gas block meets the gas tube. Now, oddly and ironically, this rifle has the same setup. Most milled AKs, actually every milled AK I've seen aside from this one, has this gas tube set up, like you have here on this old Chinese Mac 90 Type 56. As you can see, where the gas block and the gas tube meet, there are no gas ports. The gas ports run horizontally across the gas tube. That's another one of the external differences. Get this bad boy off the table. Alright. One more of the external differences that you can see on a milled AK versus a stamped AK is you can see, I'm trying to get better light here. Alright. You can barely see that. But you can see the two slots above the trigger up here, different cut above the trigger. Versus the one slot cut on the stamped receiver. Difference between the internal components of a milled receiver AK and a stamped receiver AK are quite significant as well. You will see very clearly when you compare both bolts and bolt carrier groups that the milled AK bolt carrier group is much heavier, and it also has a different face on the piston. This one is much lighter, noticeably lighter anyway, and different face on the piston. Also, you will notice that the receiver hood on the milled AK is thicker and heavier than that of the stamped. It's very obvious when you hold them both. Also, the recoil spring is one solid long spring throughout. You can see that it is heavier and thicker than the recoil spring, this dual wire AK recoil spring in the stamped AK. Now, the original, let me get this stuff back over here where it belongs. Get that stuff up here where it belongs. Alright, now before they went to the milled AKs in the 50s because of the poor technology with welding at the time. The stamped AKs before those milled AKs also had internal components much like these ones. Once the technology caught up in the late 50s and they switched back to a stamped receiver AK, the AKM rifle, they switched to these lighter internal components. I also forgot to mention that the bolt and the extractor on the milled AKs to your left, right here, are larger and heavier than the bolt and extractor on your right, which is for the stamped. Also, differences on the internals of the AK that you will notice are the dual hammer releases inside the milled AK and the much thicker metal. I mean, geez, look at that. It's really thick. The much thicker metal walls of the receiver compared to the single hammer release, you see it there, and the much thinner internal walls of the stamped receiver. It's really obvious when you touch them both, the difference in width between these two receivers. This milled receiver's got to be 3 times the thickness, if not more. A couple of things I neglected to mention previously is that stamped AKs and milled AKs have different bayonet lugs, and the rear cut of the receivers are different. You can see the stamped AK has a downward and outward cut, and the milled AK has a downward and inward cut. Also, the stamped AK has this little piece of metal cut out to cut back on some of the weight. That was the stamped. The milled does not have that cut. Also, staying on the subject of the milled receiver AK, SLR-101S, and all other milled receiver AKs. Didn't mean to knock them before. I was talking about, they're heavier, they take longer to produce, they're not as cost effective, all of which is true. But there are supposedly some plus sides. I've owned over a dozen AKs in my life, and I've probably shot more than 30. And I've never owned a milled AK before. And I've shot every other one I have, except this one. This is my newest AK. I've yet to shoot a milled AK. And a part of that is because the milled AKs are much more rare. I read somewhere that 90% of the AKs on Earth and AK variants on Earth are stamped receiver AKs, and I believe it because I've been into guns about as long as I've been walking, and nearly all of the AKs that you see when you go to gun shows or gun shops are stamped receiver AKs. You just do not see milled ones in the abundance that you do stamped ones. They're not as common. Alright, now there are, supposedly, I haven't fired this yet, I'm going to. Supposedly there is a advantage to a milled receiver AK in that, plethora of downfall that I mentioned about it being heavier and all that other stuff. The fact that it's a milled receiver and machined out of one solid piece of metal, when you shoot the gun, there is less vibration from the recoil, and because there's less vibration and flex during the recoil, it doesn't affect the trajectory and the path of the bullet as much. So it's supposed to be, because of the lack of wobble while kicking in the receiver, it's supposed to be more accurate. So that's the one positive that I've read. Now, the negative I've read is because there is no wobble and there is no flex in this gun when it fires. People say that the milled receiver AKs, because there's no give, and on a recoiling thing, there needs to be a little bit of give. People say that because there is none, that after time you can get cracks in the receiver. Now I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know how many cases of that there have been, but I do know that there are still milled AKs made in the 50s that still run like beasts to this day, being carried all over the world. Well, I guess there's only one thing left to do. AK-47, the most battle-proven, rugged, reliable rifle battle implement ever devised. Time for me to take these out to the range and see which one I prefer, stamped or milled. SGL-21 or SLR-101. I just have a few more talking points I want to get to before I show you this next part of the video, that is both rifles shooting at the same target, standing iron sights 100 yards away. The stamped SGL-21 versus the milled SLR-101S. Alternating back and forth between both rifles, 5 and 6 shots at a time in this next scene. Shooting from 100 yards out, standing iron sights. Silhouette is smaller than life scale. Bullseye at 100 yards standing was with milled SLR-101S. The AK-47 first entered frontline service in 1949, and by the mid-1950s had effectively replaced the SKS as the primary Soviet battle rifle. The 7.62 by 39mm cartridge was designed by removing the rim casing and shortening the classic 7.62 by 54R cartridge used in the Soviet Mosin Nagant, used in frontline combat in World War I and World War II. The Soviets took the idea to shorten their classic battle rifle cartridge from the Germans in World War II, when the Germans shortened their 7.92 by 57mm cartridge used in the classic Mauser and designed the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz used in the M&P rifle. Later renamed by Hitler the Sturmgewehr. English translation of that, the storm weapon. The AK-47, AKM, and other Kalashnikov variants remain the most widely used battle rifles on Earth. A 7.62 by 39mm cartridge delivers more kinetic energy at 100 yards than a .44 Magnum revolver does at the muzzle. Both rifles had great minute-of-man accuracy from a standing position with iron sights against a static target at 100 yards. And my final tally of this next scene was that with iron sights standing at 100 yards, I took 30 shots, 29 hits, and 1 miss. And also 22 of the 29 hits were at the center or near the center of the target. closing thoughts on the Arsenal SLR-101 and the Arsenal SGL-21. Basically, you guys want to know if I could see any difference in accuracy between the milled SLR-101 and the stamped SGL-21. Yes, I did. It was marginal, it's a marginal difference, but the best shots that I got of the day were definitely with the milled AK. You could clearly see that 100 yard bullseye center mass from a standing position with the SLR-101, which is pretty damn impressive from a standing position for an AK at 100 yards, if you ask me. Recoil. I was actually expecting the stamped SGL-21 to kick less than the milled SLR-101S because of the AK-74 style muzzle brake. That's supposed to be one of the very best in the world, and is. But the SLR-101's muzzle attachment must work pretty damn well itself, because with the extra weight and heft of this milled receiver, when I was shooting it, I guess all that weight just absorbed the recoil better, because the SLR-101 definitely kicked less. Also, triggers, stock triggers. A lot of people complain about the Arsenal stock triggers. I'm not one of those people. I don't mind the stock triggers on the SGL-21s and 31s. However, the stock trigger on the SLR-101 is definitely lighter, crisper, and better in my opinion. Which one do I prefer? Which one would I recommend you buying? Well, first of all, I would tell you, obviously, buy both. But you know, not everybody has the money to buy both. If I could only buy one, which would I buy? I would still buy the Arsenal SGL-21-61 because, pretty simple, the weight consideration. It's a lighter weapon. It's easier on your arms. I mean, that whole shooting scene you saw, the target was standing 100 yards away. I got the burn in my arms and the fatigue in my arms standing up shooting them both, but it was definitely worse with the milled. So I would definitely, if I was only going to get one, I would definitely get the SGL-21. Both of them are fantastic, though. Both of them will work great for you, but if you're only going to get one, Arsenal SGL-21 gets my vote.